Hi there, students. I'm XS. That's little x, little s, which stands for extra sweet, 'cause that's what I am. I'm a Puppy-sensei, and I make Japanese content to help you level up your abilities. For today's grammar drop, we're going to be looking at the conjunction Kedo in Japanese. So Kedo is a conjunction that means but or however. Just like the ga particle that you might be familiar with, Kedo links two thoughts or ideas, usually in a manner that creates a contrast between the two. In all cases, Kedo can follow a verb or an adjective, and it appears between two sentences. For example, we might use Kedo in a sentence like the following one. I like Japanese food, but I don't like natto. 日本料理が好きですけど、納豆が好きじゃありません. Alright, so first, let's address an important point right off the bat. What's the difference between these two sentences? So we've got 日本料理が好きですけど、納豆が好きじゃありません. And we've got 日本料理が好きですが、納豆が好きじゃありません. Both of these mean I like Japanese food, but I don't like natto. So what's the difference between the two? Basically not much. Both ga and kedo mean but or however. They both create a contrast between the former and the latter thoughts. They appear in the same position in the sentence, and for the most part, they're pretty much interchangeable. But there are two very tiny nuances that we should really talk about. First, Kedo is just the littlest ittiest bit more casual. In fact, when I see the sentence, 日本料理が好きですけど、納豆が好きじゃありません, I immediately feel just a little bit odd, because ですけど feels a little less common to my ear than だけど, right? Because that's going to be more casual, the casual da, plus the slightly more casual kedo. That's because we're usually going to be using kedo in informal situations anyway. It's usually going to be very conversational. Now, that's not to say that des kedo isn't grammatical or anything like that. It's fine, and there are plenty of situations where it fits perfectly, right? For instance, maybe you're holding a relatively calm conversation and maybe just shooting the breeze with somebody, but you still want to maintain a relatively formal relationship with that person. In that case, yes, des kedo makes perfect sense. But, as I said, this feels a whole lot more common. 日本料理が好きだけど、納豆が好きじゃない. Ne? Okay, so easy. Kedo is like ga, but it's just a little bit more casual. Well, the other thing that I want to point out, and this is something that I haven't really spent a whole lot of time discussing in my grammar drops yet, but actually, the truth is that there are occasional differences in style between written and spoken Japanese. It's not a particularly formalized set of very strict rules. Rather, there are just kind of conventions that we follow when writing in Japanese, and those conventions are just a little bit different from those that we follow when we're speaking Japanese. And one of those is that we rarely write kedo, since ga is preferred in written discourse. Of course, maybe you have a situation where you're perhaps transcribing something that somebody else said or something like that, and of course, in that case, that doesn't hold true, right? If you were writing something official, on the other hand, like a document or a paper or an article, then yeah, ga is preferred over kedo. We just don't usually write kedo unless we're writing what somebody said or something like that. Again, that's not necessarily a firm and absolute grammatical rule, it's just more of a cultural guideline. At some point, I'll cover in more depth the distinction between written and spoken Japanese, but for today, just know that when you're using a conjunction to create a contrast between two thoughts, kedo is quite common in conversation, and ga is used more often in writing. Now, the other thing that I want to bring up is that when we have a sentence in English that uses a conjunction, we almost always have those expressed in two halves, right? It's the conjunction in the middle of two different thoughts. For instance, I have milk, but I have no butter. I have a car, but I prefer to walk everywhere I go. I have no mouth, but I must scream. Things like that. In Japanese, however, you're sometimes going to hear conversational sentences like this one. 明日、その人気のある映画を見たいけど. When we as English speakers hear this sentence, we might feel like we're a little bit left waiting for the second half of that thought. We're not getting the contrasting complement to that sentence, and therefore we might think something like, great, you want to see that movie, but what? What's next? But what? In Japanese, though, remember that it's pretty common for speakers to approach topics in a way that can feel a little bit indirect to us. It can actually be more polite in some cases not to finish your thought after kedo. You can kind of treat this as a passing of the conversational baton, right? It's a way for the conversation to continue, and your kind of conversation partner is saying, okay, well, this thing is true, but... and now you say something. So when someone says, 明日、その人気のある映画を見たいけど, they might actually be asking for your input. So you might reply with, 一緒に行きませんか? Should we go together? Right? So they're setting you up for the payoff. They're setting you up to say, hey, I'd really like to see this movie. And they want you to say, oh, I would love to see it with you, right? But they don't want to ask you directly, so this is that indirectness that we've talked about with Japanese before. You might have heard me talking on this channel about how haiku are not really haiku in most cases. Many haiku were actually written collaboratively as part of a collaborative social drinking game. So that typical 5-7-5 poem structure, well, usually you would only say the 5 and the 7, and then you would pass the turn to the next person who would complete the poem by adding the last 5 syllables. I think sometimes we ought to keep things like that in mind when we're considering the Japanese language. Think of Japanese as a language that relies heavily on conversational collaboration. Ending your sentence with kedo and then trailing off actually offers the chance for another participant in the conversation to pick up that conversational energy, to engage further in the conversation or the dialogue. It's similar to the work being done by the sentence final particle ne, right? We've talked about that. So when you end your sentence with ne, it's kind of like, isn't it? Don't you agree? And you're asking the listener to chime in, to agree or disagree or add their unique thoughts or input. It's an invitation to participate in the conversation so that it goes back and forth and doesn't feel like a monologue. Now, this ending with kedo type structure is one that I think that we have to be careful that we're not overusing. Because if you use it all the time and you're ending all of your sentences with kedo, you might end up coming across as non-committal or, very subby or whatever. There's one final thing that I'd like to cover about this kedo form, because it's something that I'm thinking about a whole lot as a translator. I'd like you to look at this example sentence, and I want you to think about how you would translate it into English. So the sentence is, 卵がないけど、持ってくれる? So let's break this down. Tamago means eggs. The ga nai construction means there are none, or maybe we don't have any. We have kedo separating these two thoughts or ideas. And then the second idea is 持ってくれる. Now, that's a compound verb, but it can mean something like, could you get some? Could you bring me some? Something like that. Okay, great. So the first sentence is, we don't have any eggs. And then the second sentence is, could you bring me some? Wonderful. But, kedo. So since kedo is there, are we going to translate this sentence as something like, we don't have any eggs, but could you bring me some? That doesn't really feel right in English, does it? And why not? That's because when we use but or however to contrast ideas in English, we're expecting an alternative rather than a direct cause and effect chain. So, we're out of eggs, but I can make you toast. That would be a great sentence in English. Another good sentence in English might be something like, since we don't have any eggs, would you bring me some? Or because we don't have any eggs, would you bring me some? But that sentence doesn't use but, right? And we've got Kedo in our original Japanese sentence. So what's going on here? Well, basically, Kedo is slightly more versatile than but or however is in English. And it can be used to kind of softly link two sentences without any direct contrast. So, honestly, the best possible English translation for this sentence would be one like this. We're out of eggs. Would you get me some? In spite of the fact that our original Japanese sentence is all one sentence, in English, it just makes a lot more sense to split this up into two different sentences because it's two different thoughts. In English, the link just really isn't there the way it is in Japanese. And that's mostly just because in English, these two thoughts don't seem to be well linked in the same way that they are in Japanese. That Kedo is really doing soft work to connect these thoughts. It's not a hard but. Can I say that? Not a hard but? I suppose the point is that Kedo doesn't always have to be a forceful contrast between two ideas. It can instead simply provide context for the second sentence based on what we know from the first sentence. I hope that you understand all of this, but see you next week. Mata ne!